Sir, stand up. You need to come with us.
My ticket says this seat is mine. Operations hold. Multiple departures suspended.
Part 1. The first sign that something was wrong was not the accusation. It was the way the flight attendant stopped looking at Marcus Ellison's boarding pass and started looking at him. Marcus noticed small changes because his work depended on noticing them. He had spent 20 years in aviation risk management, studying the tiny moments before failures happened. A delayed inspection. A missing signature. A person assuming a system would correct itself. At 8:14 in the morning, seated in first class on a cross-country flight from Atlanta to Seattle, he watched a similar assumption unfold in front of him. He was dressed simply for a long business day. A navy jacket, a gray shirt, and the leather notebook he carried everywhere. No designer logos. No assistant walking behind him. No introduction announcing that he was the chief executive officer of one of the largest regional aviation technology companies in the country. Marcus preferred it that way. He had learned years ago that people often listen differently after they knew his title. The woman standing beside his seat did not know his title. She looked at the boarding pass in his hand, then at the seat number above him. "Sir, can you step into the aisle for a moment?" she asked. Marcus looked up. "Is there a problem?" "I just need to verify something." The words were polite. The tone was not. Around him, passengers began placing bags overhead and settling into their seats. A few people glanced over, then immediately looked away. Marcus handed her the boarding pass again. She studied it longer this time. "This seat was assigned to another passenger," she said. Marcus frowned slightly. "That's not possible." "I selected this seat when I booked the ticket. I understand what you're saying. I just need you to cooperate while we sort this out." The word cooperate stayed in the air longer than it should have. Marcus had heard versions of it before. Not during business negotiations, not during board meetings. During moments when someone had already decided he was the problem. "I'm happy to verify anything," Marcus said, "but I would like to understand what exactly is being questioned." The flight attendant looked toward the front galley. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding involving this seat." Marcus noticed something important. Nobody had checked the system yet. Nobody had scanned his ticket. Nobody had asked the passenger records desk. The conclusion had arrived before the verification. A few minutes later, another employee approached. Her name tag read Danielle Brooks, a senior cabin supervisor. She had the calm expression of someone used to handling difficult situations. "Mr. Ellison, we need you to move temporarily while we investigate." "Temporarily where? We can discuss options." Marcus glanced at the open first-class cabin around him. "Options after you remove me from my assigned seat?" Danielle paused. "It is not about removing you." Marcus looked at the boarding pass still in her hand. "Then what is it about?" The supervisor lowered her voice. "Sir, we received a concern that you may not be the passenger assigned here." That sentence changed the atmosphere. It was no longer a seat dispute. It was an accusation about whether he belonged. Marcus felt the familiar pressure to prove himself immediately, to explain his career, to mention the company he built, to call someone who could make the conversation end in seconds. But he did not. He had spent years teaching executives that systems only improved when people could see where they failed. So he simply asked one question: who verified that concern? Danielle hesitated. Nobody answered. Across the aisle, a passenger named Evelyn Carter noticed the hesitation. She had been quietly watching from her window seat since the beginning. She saw the boarding pass. She saw the employees skip the normal verification steps. She saw Marcus remain calm while everyone around him treated him like he had done something wrong. She'd opened the Notes app on her phone, not to record a confrontation, to remember details, because something about the situation felt familiar. The captain's door closed at the front of the aircraft. The boarding process continued behind them. But inside first class, a decision had already been made. A man with a valid ticket was being asked to defend his right to sit in a seat he had paid for. And nobody had yet checked the one thing that could have ended the entire misunderstanding: the system. Part 2. The wrong story did not need proof to travel. It only needed repetition. By the time Marcus Ellison was still standing beside his first-class seat, the situation had already changed shape. What began as a question about a reservation had quietly become a question about his behavior. That was how these situations often moved. A person was not accused of doing something wrong. They were accused of creating a problem. Danielle Brooks, the cabin supervisor, stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Mr. Ellison, I'm trying to resolve this professionally." Marcus looked at her. "So am I. Then please understand that we have procedures." "I agree. Procedures are exactly what should happen here." Danielle glanced at the boarding pass again. "We need you to cooperate while we complete a review." Marcus noticed the wording, not verify, not confirm, review. A word that sounded neutral while placing him inside a process he had not caused. "I'm willing to wait while someone checks the reservation system," Marcus said. "But I'm not moving based on an assumption." The passenger in the row behind him shifted uncomfortably. A man across the aisle whispered, "Maybe they should just handle it quietly." Marcus heard him. He always heard those comments. The ones that were not openly hostile. The ones that sounded reasonable because they focused on convenience instead of fairness. He turned back toward the supervisor. "Can you tell me who believes this seat belongs to someone else?" Danielle paused. "The other passenger has not boarded yet." Marcus looked toward the empty seat beside him. "So this is based on a passenger who isn't here." Another pause. A small one, but Marcus saw it. The moment when a person realizes the explanation they were given does not survive basic questions. Before Danielle could answer, a man in a dark business suit approached from the aisle. He introduced himself as Thomas Reed, the airline's customer experience manager assigned to premium cabins. His voice was smooth. "I understand there's a disagreement about seating." Marcus almost smiled. Disagreement. Another softer word. "I don't believe there is a disagreement," Marcus said. "I believe there is a record that can be checked." Thomas looked at him carefully. "We have received concerns regarding your access to this cabin." The phrase was different this time. Access. Not seat, not reservation. Access. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, but his expression stayed steady. "My ticket was scanned at the gate." "Yes, the system accepted it." "Yes. So what additional concern requires this conversation?" Thomas glanced toward Danielle. That glance told Marcus something. They were not building a solution. They were building a justification. "We are simply asking for patience," Thomas said. Marcus nodded. "Patience is reasonable. Presumption is not." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Thomas asked the question Marcus had been expecting. "Would you be willing to move to another seat while we sort this out?" Marcus looked around the cabin. The request sounded small. Almost harmless. But he understood what it represented. A person with a valid ticket was being asked to surrender his position before anyone proved there was a mistake. "No," Marcus said. Thomas raised his eyebrows. "No, I'm willing to participate in verification. I'm not willing to accept a penalty before verification happens." The conversation drew more attention. Not because Marcus was loud, because he was not. He was calm, and calm made the imbalance easier to see. Near the window, Evelyn Carter continued writing notes. She was not recording faces or trying to create a public spectacle. She was documenting a sequence. Time, words, actions. She had spent 15 years working in healthcare administration, where small errors in records could affect real people. She knew the difference between a mistake and a pattern. At 8:27 a.m., the gate agent who had scanned Marcus's ticket was contacted through the cabin communication system. A few minutes later, a message came back. The boarding record was correct. The seat assignment was correct. The ticket was valid. The cabin went quiet. But instead of apologizing, Thomas changed direction. "Mr. Ellison, there may have been a system irregularity." Marcus looked at him. "A system irregularity? Yes, we are still investigating." Marcus glanced at his watch. "The flight was scheduled to depart in 12 minutes. And while you investigate, what exactly is my status?" Thomas did not answer immediately. That hesitation mattered more than the words that followed. "Please remain available. Available. Not seated. Not welcomed. Available." Marcus looked at the empty seat in front of him, then at the employees surrounding him. He had built his company around aviation systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of failure. A system did not collapse because one person made a mistake. It collapsed when nobody wanted to admit the mistake existed. Then Thomas received a message on his handheld device. His expression changed, not dramatically, just enough. Because the issue was no longer only inside the cabin. The airline's operations center had flagged something unexpected. A corporate account connected to the passenger reservation had triggered an internal review. Marcus Ellison was not just a passenger, but the employees around him still did not know why. and the next decision they made would determine whether this was a misunderstanding or a failure the airline could no longer hide. Part 3. The message on Thomas Reed's device should have been reassuring. Instead, it made him more careful. He read it twice before putting the screen down, Marcus noticed. Not because Thomas looked afraid, because he looked like someone who had just realized the situation was larger than the explanation he had been given. "Is everything all right?" Marcus asked. Thomas placed the device in his pocket. "We are continuing our review." Marcus almost laughed, not because anything was funny, because the phrase had become a wall. Every time someone reached the edge of accountability, another layer of procedure appeared. He had spent years inside aviation operations. He knew how organizations protected themselves when something went wrong. They slowed the conversation. They changed the vocabulary. They moved from facts to process. And sometimes, without anyone saying it directly, they waited for the person with the complaint to become tired. Marcus looked toward the aisle. "I have a question." Thomas nodded. "Go ahead. When your team scanned my boarding pass, what did the system show?" Thomas hesitated. "That information is being reviewed." Marcus looked at him. That's not an answer. The supervisor, Danielle, stepped in. "Mr. Ellison, we're not trying to make this difficult." Marcus turned toward her. "I believe you." The response surprised her. But difficulty is not always created by the person asking questions. That sentence stayed with her, because Danielle knew there was something wrong. She had handled thousands of passengers. She knew the difference between someone trying to cause a scene and someone trying to prevent a mistake from being hidden. Marcus was not demanding special treatment. He was asking for the same treatment everyone else received. Verification before judgment. At the front of the cabin, another employee appeared. This time, it was a gate operations specialist named Aaron Wells. He held a tablet. "I need to speak with the cabin supervisor." Danielle stepped aside. They spoke quietly for several seconds. Marcus could not hear every word, but he caught pieces. Corporate profile, priority account, boarding authorization, executive notification. The words meant little to the passengers around him. But they meant something to Marcus. His company had spent years developing aviation safety software used by smaller airlines and transportation operators across the country. The airline he was currently flying had recently been testing a new version of that technology. Marcus had never announced his involvement publicly. He did not want influence. He wanted results. That was why he had booked the flight under his personal name instead of using corporate travel services. He wanted to experience the customer process like everyone else. Now he was seeing something no report had ever captured. The moment a system failed before the system had a chance to correct itself. Aaron looked uncomfortable when he returned. "Mr. Ellison, there appears to have been a mistake." Marcus waited. There it was. The sentence everyone had been avoiding. A mistake. But Marcus knew mistakes had different meanings. A wrong seat assignment was a mistake. A person being treated as suspicious before anyone checked the record was a decision. "I appreciate you acknowledging that," Marcus said. Aaron nodded. "We're correcting it now." "Good." The employees seemed relieved. Marcus did not sit down, not yet. "Before I return to my seat, I need to know something." Thomas looked cautious. "What?" "Was I moved because of a system error?" No one answered immediately. Marcus continued. "Or because someone decided the system was wrong before checking it." Danielle looked away. That was the answer. A few rows back, Evelyn Carter noticed it too. The issue was no longer whether Marcus belonged in first class. That question had already been answered. The larger question was why the airline's first response was not verification. It was suspicion. The flight was now delayed by 11 minutes. Normally, that would have been a minor inconvenience. But inside the airline's operations center, the situation was beginning to move. A routine internal alert had been triggered. Not because Marcus had complained, because the reservation system had recognized his account connection and automatically escalated the incident for executive review. Someone in operations had just seen the report. The passenger they had treated as a problem was Marcus Ellison, the founder and CEO of Ellison Aviation Systems, the company responsible for a major portion of the airline's upcoming technology upgrade. But Marcus was not thinking about revenge. He was thinking about the first employee who would be blamed, because he knew how these situations usually worked. The person at the bottom of the chain often carried the weight of decisions made much higher up. He looked at Danielle. Who trained your team to handle situations like this? The question caught her off guard. She expected anger, not curiosity. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, was this one person making a bad choice? Marcus glanced around the cabin. Or is this what happens when people believe a certain passenger requires more suspicion than another? Danielle did not respond, because she did not have an answer yet. And somewhere inside the airline's headquarters, executives were receiving the first details of a problem that was no longer a seating dispute. It was becoming an operational review, a reputation issue, and possibly a test of whether the company's systems protected every passenger equally. At 8:39 a.m., Marcus finally sat back down. But he did not open his laptop. He opened his notebook. On the first page, he wrote 3 words, "Sequence matters." Because in aviation, the order of events was everything, and the sequence that morning had already revealed more than anyone intended. Part 4, Marcus Ellison had learned that apologies often arrived before accountability. The apology was usually easier. It required a sentence. Accountability required a process. It required people to look at decisions they had made when they still believed nobody important was watching. By the time the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, Marcus had received 3 different explanations. The first was a seat assignment confusion. The second was a system irregularity. The third was an internal communication issue. None of them answered the question he cared about. Why had the first assumption been that he did not belong? Marcus stared out the window as the runway lights moved past the glass. He had spent most of his adult life building systems designed around one simple principle. A machine could only be trusted if people were willing to examine where it failed. That principle had shaped Ellison Aviation Systems. When a sensor produced an unusual reading, engineers did not blame the sensor. They investigated the conditions around it. When a safety report looked incomplete, they did not punish the person who reported it. They asked why the process allowed the problem to exist. But on this flight, the process had worked differently. The people had become the system, and the system had made a decision before collecting the facts. His phone vibrated. It was a message from his chief operating officer, Lena Whitmore. "I saw the incident alert. Are you okay?" Marcus stared at the screen. He typed a response. "I'm fine." "Don't escalate yet. I want facts first." A few seconds passed. Then another message arrived. "Marcus, they flagged you as a passenger concern." That report is already circulating internally." He read the sentence twice. Passenger concern. A phrase that could mean almost anything. That was the danger of vague language inside large organizations. It became containers, and whoever controlled the wording often controlled the story. Marcus replied, "Preserve the original report. Do not let anyone edit the timeline." Lena responded immediately. "Already done." Marcus placed the phone down. That was one thing he trusted about Lena. She did not react emotionally before securing information. Years earlier, when they were still a small aviation consulting company operating from a shared office, she had taught him something he never forgot. The first version of an incident is usually the version people want to be true, she had told him. The real version takes work. Marcus looked around the first-class cabin. Most passengers were focused on their own lives. A businessman was typing on a laptop. A woman was reading a book. Someone was sleeping under a blanket. For them, the incident had already passed. For Marcus, it had become a question, not a personal one. A structural one. During the flight, he reviewed the information Lena sent, the original customer service note, the internal cabin communication, the gate scan confirmation, the timeline, and one detail stood out. The employee who first raised the concern had written that Marcus appeared inconsistent with the expected profile for the cabin. Marcus stopped reading. Expected profile. He leaned back. Those 3 words carried more weight than the company probably understood, because they revealed something hidden. The issue had never been the ticket. The issue had been perception. Someone had looked at a black man sitting in first class and decided the explanation needed to come before the evidence. Marcus closed the file, but he did not forward it. Not yet. He wanted to know who wrote the sentence. And more importantly, who approved it. When the aircraft landed in Seattle, Marcus did not walk through the terminal surrounded by executives. He did not make a public statement. He did not call reporters. Instead, he went directly to a quiet meeting room near the airport operations office. There was Lena. She had brought printed documents. "You know this is bigger than one employee," she said. Marcus removed his jacket and placed it over the back of a chair. I know. Already trying to frame it as a training issue. Marcus looked at her. Do you believe that? Lena hesitated. No. That answer mattered. Because Lena was not someone who searched for conflict. She searched for causes. Marcus opened the folder. Then let's find out what caused it. Lena placed another document on the table. A passenger experience audit from the previous year. Marcus scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. His expression changed, not because he found proof of intentional wrongdoing. He had not. He found something more complicated, a pattern. The airline's internal reviews showed several complaints where passengers had reported being asked for additional verification in premium areas. Different cities, different employees, different dates, but similar language. Questions about belonging, questions about access, questions that appeared harmless when viewed separately. Together they showed something else. A process problem. Marcus closed the folder. This is why I don't want anyone fired today. Lena looked surprised. After what happened? Yes. Marcus, if we remove one person and leave the system untouched, the next passenger gets the same treatment from someone else. Lena nodded slowly. That was the difference between punishment and repair. One ended a story. The other changed what happened next. But before they could continue, Marcus's phone rang. It was a call from the airline's executive office. The CEO wanted to speak with him immediately. Not tomorrow. Not after a review. Immediately. Because inside the airline, leadership had just discovered something they had not expected. The incident involving Marcus Ellison had activated a compliance review, and that review was connected to more than one flight. More than one airport. Marcus answered the call. Mr. Ellison, the voice said, we need to discuss what happened. Marcus looked at the documents spread across the table. The single-seat dispute was gone. Something larger had taken its place. Before we discuss what happened to me, Marcus replied, I want to know how many other passengers this happened to. There was silence on the other end. A silence that confirmed his question had reached somewhere it was not supposed to. And by the time the call ended, the airline would make a decision that would affect hundreds of flights across the country. Not because Marcus demanded revenge, because the evidence suggested the problem had been allowed to continue. Part 5. The airline CEO did not begin the conversation with an apology. Marcus noticed that immediately, not because he expected one, because he understood what the absence meant. People rarely apologized before they understood the full size of a problem. The voice on the phone belonged to Adrian Cole, the chief executive officer of North Star Meridian Airlines, a company that had spent the last year publicly promoting itself as one of the most customer-focused carriers in the country. Mr. Ellison, Adrian said, I want you to know that we take this situation seriously. Marcus stood near the conference room window overlooking the airport. Planes moved across the runway below. Thousands of passengers were beginning their journeys, unaware that a decision made inside one cabin was now being examined by people who controlled an entire operation. I appreciate that, Marcus replied. Adrian continued. We are reviewing the employee interactions, the communication chain, and the reservation records. Marcus looked down at the documents on the table. Reviewing only my incident? A pause. Small, but noticeable. No, Adrian said. Marcus waited. We have expanded the review. How far? Another pause. Several airports. There it was. The sentence Adrian had hoped not to say. The problem was no longer contained. Marcus turned away from the window. What triggered the expansion? Adrian did not answer immediately. That hesitation told Marcus the airline already knew more than it had shared. Finally, Adrian said, Your account was connected to our Aviation Technology Partnership Review System. Marcus nodded. So my name made someone look closer. Yes. And if my name had not been there? The silence returned, this time longer. Marcus did not need the answer. He already knew. A person without a recognized name, without corporate connections, without a reason for executives to care, might have walked away believing they had simply been treated unfairly. The system would have moved on. Adrian finally spoke. That is something we need to investigate. You're sat down, then investigate it honestly. I intend to, not just the employee behavior. Adrian listened. The decision-making process. The airline CEO understood the difference. An employee could make a mistake. A system could make thousands. After the call ended, Marcus remained in the conference room with Lena. For several minutes, neither spoke. The airport continued moving outside the glass. Baggage carts crossed the pavement. Ground crews guided aircraft into position. Everything looked normal. That was what bothered Marcus. The most damaging failures were often the ones that happened inside ordinary days. Lena opened her laptop. "We have something else." Marcus looked over. "What?" "The airline's internal customer concern database." "From where?" "One of our compliance contacts received a copy before the review team locked access." Marcus's expression changed. "Authorized?" "Yes. They preserved it before access was restricted." He nodded. "Good." The file contained hundreds of entries, not all related to race, not all connected to first class. Some were complaints about communication. Some were disagreements between employees and passengers. But a smaller group had something unusual, a repeated pattern of additional questioning in premium areas, requests for extra identification, requests for explanation, requests that some passengers described as humiliating. Marcus read through several. Different names, different locations, different employees, but the same type of assumption. A passenger's right to be there was treated as something they needed to prove. Lena watched him carefully. "You're quiet." Marcus closed the laptop. "I'm thinking about how many people never complained." "It bothers you?" "Yes, why?" Marcus looked back toward the runway. "Because complaints are only the visible part." He remembered his first years in business, before the contracts, before the employees, before anyone cared about what company name appeared on his office door. He remembered walking into meetings where people assumed he was an assistant. Remembered having his ideas repeated by someone else and suddenly considered valuable. Remembered learning that sometimes the hardest part was not proving you were qualified. It was deciding whether the effort of proving it was worth the cost. His phone buzzed. A message from Evelyn Carter. The passenger who had watched everything from across the aisle. Marcus recognized the name from the incident report. He opened the message. "Mr. Ellison, I don't know if you remember me. I was sitting across from you. I wrote down what happened because I was afraid the details would get changed later. I'm willing to speak if it helps." Marcus read it twice. A witness. Not a perfect witness, not someone who had captured every second, but someone who understood something important. Memory mattered. Sequence mattered. And silence had a cost. Lena looked at the message. "Will you use her statement?" Marcus placed the phone down. "If she chooses to give it." "You're not asking her?" "No. Why?" "Because people should not have to risk something just because they saw something wrong." That answer stayed with Lena. Because it explained why Marcus had never wanted this to become a story about him. He was not trying to prove he deserved first class. He was trying to understand why the system needed proof before offering basic respect. Later that afternoon, North Star Meridian Airlines issued a confidential operational notice. Not a public announcement. Not yet. A review order. 200 flights across the network were placed under temporary operational monitoring while the company examined passenger handling procedures, employee reports, and premium cabin verification practices. The notice did not say the word discrimination. It did not assign blame. It used careful corporate language, but everyone inside the airline understood what it meant. Something serious had been found, and now leadership had to decide whether they were investigating an isolated mistake, or confronting a culture that had learned to call a pattern something else. Marcus looked at the notice one more time. The numbers stood out. 200 flights. 200 moments where a small decision could become someone's memory of whether they belong. And for the first time since boarding that morning, Marcus understood the true size of what had happened. The seat had never been the issue. The seat was only where the pattern became visible. Part 6. The airline wanted the problem to remain a review. Marcus understood why. Review sounded controlled. A review suggested professionals sitting in a room, looking at documents, reaching conclusions. A review did not suggest that hundreds of passengers might have been treated differently because employees trusted assumptions more than records. But Marcus also understood something else. A review was only meaningful if the people conducting it were willing to discover something they did not want to find. 3 days after the flight, Marcus arrived at North Star Meridian Airlines headquarters for the first formal meeting. He did not arrive as a CEO. He arrived as the person who had been sitting in seat 4A. That distinction mattered to him. Inside the conference room were representatives from operations, customer experience, compliance, training, and human resources. The table was covered with folders. Everyone had prepared. Everyone knew the meeting mattered. Adrian Cole, the airline CEO, opened the discussion. "We want this process to be transparent." Marcus nodded. "Then let's start with the timeline." A few people looked surprised. They expected a conversation about feelings. Marcus wanted sequence, because sequence showed decisions. The compliance director, Rachel Kim, displayed the incident record on the screen. At 8:14 a.m., the cabin team received a concern regarding your seat assignment. Marcus looked at the screen. Was the concern based on a system discrepancy? Rachel glanced at her notes. No. Was it based on a passenger report? No. Then what was it based on? Hume became still. Rachel answered carefully. The initial note stated that the passenger profile did not appear consistent with expectations for the cabin. Marcus did not react immediately. He had already read those words. Hearing them spoken aloud changed something. "Expectations," he repeated. "Yes. Who defines those expectations?" Rachel looked toward the customer experience department. No one spoke. That was the problem. The expectation existed, but nobody wanted to own creating it. Marcus opened his notebook. "Let's not make this about whether someone intended harm." Several people looked up. That was not the direction they expected. "Intent matters," Marcus continued, "but systems also matter. A person can make a decision without realizing what influenced it." He pointed to the screen. "The question is why the first action was suspicion instead of verification." The training director, Paul Mercer, leaned forward. "We believe additional training may address this." Pierce looked at him. "Training for whom?" Paul paused. "For employees involved in premium cabin interactions. That's part of the answer." "Part, yes." Marcus turned back to the screen. "If your process depends on every employee making the perfect judgment under pressure, then your process is fragile." The compliance team continued presenting. They had reviewed 200 flights. They had examined customer notes. They had compared employee reports with passenger feedback. The results were complicated. Not every complaint involved discrimination. Not every additional verification request was inappropriate. There were legitimate safety and security reasons for some passenger checks. Marcus agreed with that. That was important, because he did not want a solution built on fear of making any mistake. He wanted a system that could tell the difference between a necessary check and an assumption. Then Rachel showed the next finding, a pattern in language. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly. Unable to explain access. Unclear premium eligibility. Questionable cabin fit. The words sounded administrative, but they carried judgment. Marcus stared at the screen. A person reading one report might miss the issue. A person reading hundreds could not. "Did anyone analyze these notes before?" he asked. Rachel answered quietly. "Yes. Several months ago." Marcus looked at Adrian. "And what happened?" The airline CEO did not avoid the question. "We classified them as customer experience inconsistencies. Not discrimination, not bias, not a policy failure. A softer category." Marcus leaned back. That classification protected the company from seeing the pattern. Nobody argued, because the statement was difficult to challenge. The meeting continued for another hour. They discussed policy language, employee incentives, reporting systems, the difference between a security concern and a social assumption. But one disagreement remained. Adrian wanted immediate public communication. Marcus disagreed. "You think silence is dangerous," Adrian said. "It is." "Then why not announce everything?" Marcus looked at him. "Because announcing a problem before you understand the solution can turn accountability into performance." The CEO considered that, Marcus continued. "People need to know what changed, not just what happened." That afternoon, the airline created an independent review panel, not because Marcus demanded it, because the internal evidence showed the company could not investigate itself without questioning its own blind spots. Evelyn Carter agreed to provide her statement. She did not want attention. She did not want to become a public figure. She simply wanted the timeline preserved. Her statement was short. She described what she saw. Who spoke first? What questions were asked? What was not checked? What happened before anyone knew Marcus's identity? That last point mattered most, because after people learned who Marcus was, everyone became more careful. But the investigation was focused on what happened before they knew. That was where the truth lived. Late that evening, Marcus returned home. His wife, Natalie, found him sitting at the kitchen table with his notebook open. "You're still working on it?" Marcus smiled slightly. "I'm thinking. Same thing with you." He laughed quietly. For a moment, there was no airline, no investigation, no headlines. Just a man sitting in his kitchen, trying to decide what responsibility looked like when he had the power to force an outcome. Natalie placed a cup of coffee beside him. "Are you trying to fix the airline?" Marcus looked down at the notebook. "No." "Then what?" He thought for a moment. "I'm trying to make sure the next person doesn't need my name to be treated correctly." The next morning, the independent review team requested access to something unexpected. Not employee files, not passenger complaints, not training records. They wanted the airline's decision models, because they had discovered something deeper. The problem might not only be in what employees said, it might be hidden in the way the organization taught people what to notice. And if that was true, the seat on Flight 482 was only the first visible crack. Part 7. The first thing the independent review team discovered was that the airline did not have a single problem. It had several small decisions connected together, and that made the situation harder. A single mistake could be corrected. A pattern required understanding. After the first-class incident, Marcus returned to North Star Meridian Airlines headquarters for the accountability review. This time, the room looked different. There were fewer people. No one brought a presentation designed to make the problem appear smaller. The independent panel sat at the center of the table. Rachel Kim from compliance was there. Adrian Cole was there. Danielle Brooks, the cabin supervisor from the flight, was there too. Marcus noticed her immediately, not because she looked nervous, because she looked tired. There was a difference. Nervous people feared consequences. Tired people carried the weight of realizing something about themselves. The review chair, Dr. Porter, opened the meeting. "We are not here to determine whether one employee had bad intentions." She looked around the room. "We are here to determine how decisions were made, what allowed those decisions to happen, and what must change." Marcus appreciated the wording. Accountability was not about finding one person to blame. It was about finding where responsibility existed. The first document placed on the screen was the original cabin report. The same report Marcus had seen before. But this time, the panel examined every line, every word, every choice. "Let's start here," Elaine said. She highlighted the phrase, "Passenger profile inconsistent with premium cabin expectations." What objective information supports this statement? Nobody answered. The question remained on the screen. After several seconds, Rachel spoke. "There was no objective information." "Then why was it written?" Rachel looked down. "Because the employee believed there was a concern." Marcus leaned forward. "Believing there is a concern is not the same as identifying one." Hume stayed quiet. Elaine nodded. "That distinction is central." The panel moved through the timeline. The boarding pass had scanned correctly. The reservation matched. The payment information matched. The seat assignment matched. The only irregularity was the assumption that something was wrong. Then the panel introduced the next piece of information. A training document. Not a secret document. Not hidden. A document used by employees across the airline. Marcus read the section carefully. It described premium cabin interactions, customer expectations, escalation procedures, language choices. At first glance, it appeared professional. But the review team had identified a problem. Certain examples repeatedly showed the same type of passenger being framed as requiring additional explanation. Not directly, not intentionally, but consistently. Images, the scenarios, the examples used in training, they shaped what employees noticed first. Marcus understood. A system did not need to instruct people to discriminate openly. Sometimes it only needed to teach them what to question. Danielle spoke for the first time. "I want to say something." Everyone looked at her. She folded her hands. "When I approached Mr. Ellison, I thought I was following procedure." Marcus listened. "I believed I was being careful." She paused. "But after reviewing everything, I realized I was careful with the wrong interrupted. I was careful about protecting the cabin from a possibility." She looked down. "But I wasn't careful enough about protecting a passenger from being wrongly treated. It was not a perfect apology." Marcus noticed that. It did not contain dramatic promises. It did not erase what happened. It was honest. Elaine asked her a question. "Did you believe you were acting unfairly at the time?" Danielle shook her head. No. Them. Do you believe the action was unfair now? A longer pause. Yes, that mattered. Because change rarely started with someone admitting they were a villain. It started when someone accepted that good intentions did not remove harmful outcomes. The panel then presented its recommendation, not immediate termination, not a public punishment campaign, a corrective plan. The airlines would suspend the existing premium verification guidelines, create a new review standard, require objective criteria before additional passenger questioning, audit customer interaction reports quarterly, and establish an independent channel for complaints involving unequal treatment. Then came the most difficult part. The airline had to examine the 200 monitored flights. Not all would show misconduct, but all had to be reviewed, because uncertainty was no longer an excuse to avoid looking. Adrian turned toward Marcus. There is something I need to ask. Marcus waited. If we move forward with these changes, will Ellison Aviation Systems continue the technology partnership? The question was expected. Marcus had known it would come. His company had significant leverage. A public withdrawal could create serious pressure. But Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the documents on the table. The partnership continues. Several people appeared surprised. But with conditions. Adrian nodded. What conditions? The company will not evaluate this airline based on whether it avoids criticism. Marcus closed the folder. We will evaluate it based on whether it builds systems that make criticism less necessary. The review ended 4 hours later. The findings were not released publicly yet. The airline wanted time to implement the first changes, but inside the company the impact was already spreading. Employees received new instructions, managers received new responsibilities. Supervisors were told that escalation was not success. The solution was. That evening, Marcus received a message from Evelyn Carter. She had completed her formal statement. I hope this actually changes something. A lot of people see things happen and decide it is easier not to get involved. Marcus read the message for a long time. Then he replied, I hope so too. But change is not what happens when people notice a problem. It is what happens after they decide they cannot ignore it anymore. The next morning, North Star Meridian Airlines prepared its public announcement. But before the statement went out, executives received one final report. A review of the 200 flights had found something unexpected. Not hundreds of identical incidents, something more complicated. Several employees had reported concerns about the same internal process months earlier. The concerns had reached management, and they had been categorized as isolated complaints, until a CEO sitting in first class forced the company to ask the question it had avoided. What if the problem was never the passengers? What if the problem was the way the system was trained to see them? Part 8. The public announcement was released at 9 a.m. on a Monday. North Star Meridian Airlines did not describe it as a crisis, so the statement used careful language. A review, a commitment, a process improvement initiative. Corporate statements were often written to reduce uncertainty, but Marcus knew something important. Sometimes the words chosen after a problem revealed as much as the problem itself. He read the statement from his office. The airline acknowledged inconsistencies in passenger verification practices and announced several changes, new review standards, independent oversight, additional training, revised reporting process. It did not mention Marcus by name. It did not need to. Everyone inside the company knew where the review began, but the announcement was only the beginning. The harder part was what happened after people stopped watching. 2 days later, Marcus returned to North Star Meridian Airlines headquarters. This time, he was not there as a customer. He was there as part of the implementation meeting. The difference mattered. The first meeting had been about discovering what happened. This one was about deciding what would happen next. Rachel Kim from Compliance opened the meeting with a progress report. The first phase of the audit is complete. Marcus looked at the documents. How many flights have been reviewed? 200. And the results. Rachel took a breath. Most did not show violations. Marcus nodded. That answer mattered. A serious investigation was not about proving a predetermined conclusion. It was about following facts, even when the facts were complicated. What did you find? He asked. Rachel changed the screen. 37 interactions required additional review. The room became focused. Of those, 14 showed documentation problems. Employees recorded concerns without objective justification. Marcus studied the report. And the rest? Different issues. Communication failures, poor escalation decisions, inconsistent application of policy. The numbers were not dramatic, they were worse, because they showed something ordinary. A system that could fail quietly. A single dramatic incident was easy to notice. 100 small decisions were harder. Adrian looked at Marcus. "We are moving forward with disciplinary reviews where appropriate." Marcus nodded. "Good, but there is something we need to discuss." "What?" "Cabin team involved in your flight." Marcus waited. Danielle's name appeared on the report. She was the supervisor present. "Yes. She has accepted responsibility." Marcus remained silent. Adrian continued. "We are considering termination." Marcus looked up. "Guy." The question surprised him, because she made the wrong decision. "Yes," Marcus said. "But what decision?" Adrian paused. "The decision to escalate the situation. That was part of it." Marcus pointed to the report, but she also became the person who helped identify the problem once she understood it. The room was quiet. Marcus was not defending what happened. He was separating accountability from convenience. If the company removes every person who they were part of a flawed system after they admit it, you teach people one lesson. What lesson? That honesty is dangerous. Rachel nodded slowly. It was a point the review team had discussed. Accountability required consequences, but organizations also needed people willing to admit mistakes before they became permanent. The final decision was not simple. Danielle would not be promoted. She would not be treated as a hero. She would receive formal discipline and mandatory leadership retraining. But she would remain with the company. Because the panel determined that her later actions contributed to correcting the failure. Marcus accepted the decision, not because it satisfied him, because it was proportionate. That was something he had learned from aviation. Safety did not improve when people were punished randomly. It improved when people understood exactly what went wrong. Later that afternoon, Marcus visited the airline's training center. He wanted to see the changes himself, not a presentation, not a report, the actual process. A group of supervisors were reviewing new scenarios. The old training focused on recognizing unusual situations. The new training focused on defining objective reasons before taking action. The difference seemed small, but Marcus knew small differences changed outcomes. One supervisor asked him a question. "Mr. Ellison, can I ask something?" "Sure." "How do we know when we are being careful versus when we are making assumptions?" Marcus considered the question. It was the right question. "The answer is not always obvious." The supervisor waited. "But you can start by asking yourself whether you would make the same request if the person in front of you looked different." Nobody wrote it down. Nobody needed to. The room understood. That evening, Marcus received another message from Evelyn Carter. This time, she sent a photograph, not of the incident, a picture of a small handwritten note she had kept during the flight. The note contained the timeline she created. 8:14. First request to move, 8:27, ticket confirmation, 8:39. A supervisor's acknowledgement. She wrote, "I almost deleted this. I thought nobody would care." Marcus stared at the message. That sentence bothered him more than anything else. Not because Evelyn had almost deleted it, because many people probably did. They experienced something unfair. They remembered it. Then they decided the cost of speaking was too high. Though Marcus replied, "Thank you for keeping it." A few minutes later, she answered, "Thank you for making sure it mattered." Marcus placed the phone down. The airline had changed policies. It had reviewed flights. It had created new systems. Those things mattered. But he knew the hardest part was not changing documents. It was changing the moment when someone saw something wrong and decided whether it was worth saying something. Even 3 months after the incident, Northstar Meridian Airlines completed the first stage of its reforms. The company released an updated report. It included the number of reviewed flights, the categories of issues found, the changes implemented, and the timeline for future audits. There was no dramatic firing announcement, no single person carrying the entire blame. Instead, there was something more difficult. A record. A correction. A system admitting where it had failed. But Marcus knew one question remained. Could a company truly change how it saw people? Or would old habits return once the attention disappeared? The answer would not come from another statement. It would come from what happened when nobody expected a CEO to be sitting in the room. Part 9. 6 months after the flight. Marcus Ellison returned to the same airport where everything had started. He did not come through the first-class entrance. He did not arrive with cameras waiting outside. He walked through the main terminal carrying the same leather notebook he had carried that morning. The airport looked exactly the same. The announcements, the rolling luggage, the quiet urgency of people trying to reach somewhere on time. That was what interested Marcus. Real change rarely announced itself. It showed up in ordinary moments. He was there to observe the final phase of North Star Meridian Airlines passenger experience audit, not as an executive, not as a partner, as a person watching whether a promise had become practice. The first stop was the customer service training area. A group of employees were reviewing a new escalation scenario. The situation was familiar. A passenger questioned about access to a premium area, but the response was different. The employee was required to identify the objective concern first, not the passenger's appearance, not assumptions, not what seemed unusual, the reason. Marcus watched quietly from the back of the room. After the exercise ended, the instructor asked the employees what changed. One employee raised his hand. He used to focus on avoiding complaints. The instructor nodded. And now? Now we focus on making sure the decision can be explained. Marcus appreciated that answer, because explanations revealed systems. A decision that could not be explained usually could not be defended. After the training session, Marcus met with Danielle Brooks. It was the first time they had spoken privately since the flight. She looked different, not transformed, just more honest about what had happened. "I've thought about that day a lot," she said. Marcus nodded. "I imagine you have." Danielle looked toward the training room. "When it happened, I kept telling myself I was protecting the cabin." Marcus listened. "I thought the safest thing was to remove uncertainty." She paused. "But I never asked whether I was creating uncertainty for someone else." That was the part that stayed with Marcus. Not because Danielle's realization fixed what happened. It did not. A passenger being humiliated could not be erased by someone understanding the mistake later. Accountability was not only about looking backward. It was about whether a person's next decision changed because they understood the last one. "I appreciate you being honest," Marcus said. Danielle nodded. "I know that doesn't undo it." The answer was direct and Danielle accepted it. "But it matters what you do after." She looked down. That was enough. No perfect forgiveness. No emotional performance. Just two people acknowledging something complicated. Later that afternoon, Marcus attended a meeting with the airline's oversight committee. The final audit report was complete. The results were mixed. Some employees had violated procedures. Some managers had ignored warning signs. Some complaints had been categorized incorrectly. But the report also found something important. After the reforms began, the number of unsupported premium cabin intervention requests decreased significantly. The system was changing because the expectations were changing. Adrian Cole presented the final recommendations. Quarterly audits will continue. Independent. Complaints review will remain permanent. Training updates will be mandatory. Marcus reviewed the document. Everything was there. But he noticed one missing piece. "What happens when the numbers improve?" The room looked at him. "What do you mean?" Adrian asked. "What happens when 6 months pass and everyone feels comfortable again?" Answered. Marcus continued. "Because the easiest time to follow a rule is when everyone remembers why it exists." He closed the report. The test is whether the rule survives after people forget. That became the final addition to the reform plan. Not just measuring outcomes, measuring attention. The airline would continue reviewing decisions even when complaints decreased, because the absence of complaints did not always mean the absence of problems. Sometimes it meant people had stopped believing speaking up would help. That evening, Marcus sat at home with Natalie. The investigation was over. The meetings were finished. The reports were published. For the first time in months, there was no urgent call waiting. Natalie placed dinner on the table. "You look disappointed," Marcus smiled. "Do I?" He thought about it. People expect these situations to end with one dramatic moment. And it didn't? No. Marcus looked toward the window. "The hardest part is that real change is usually boring." Natalie smiled. "Boring sounds healthy." He laughed. Maybe she was right. A new policy was not dramatic. A revised training module was not dramatic. A manager asking a better question before making a decision was not dramatic. But those small things were where systems actually changed. The next morning, Marcus received an email from North Star Meridian Airlines. Attached was the final public accountability report, but there was another message below it, a note from the airline's customer relations team. A passenger had submitted a new complaint. Marcus opened the summary. At first, he assumed it was another review request, then he read the details. The complaint was not about first class, not about a seat, not about Marcus's incident. It was about a different department, a different airport, a different process. But the passenger had included one sentence. I reported this because I saw that the airline actually listened before. Marcus sat back. That was the unexpected result. The purpose of changing a system was not only correcting what happened before, it was creating enough trust that people believed the next report would be taken seriously. He looked at the email for a long moment. The original problem was closed. The flight, the seat, the investigation, the accountability. All of it had reached an ending. But the impact of that ending was moving somewhere else, not as a crisis, not as revenge, as a new expectation. And for Marcus, that was the part worth protecting, because a system did not prove it had changed when it handled a famous person correctly. It proved it when nobody important was watching. Part 10. The final report from North Star Meridian Airlines was released on a quiet Tuesday morning. There was no dramatic press conference. No executives standing beneath bright lights promising that everything had changed overnight. Instead, the company published a detailed accountability document that included what had happened, what had been reviewed, and what would continue to be monitored. Marcus Ellison read the report from his office. He noticed the difference immediately. The first version of the company's response had been written to control uncertainty. This one was written to explain decisions. That difference mattered. The report confirmed that the original incident involving Marcus had resulted from an improper passenger verification process. The investigation found that employees acted on assumptions rather than objective criteria before confirming the reservation information. The airline also confirmed that the broader review of 200 monitored flights had identified several categories of concern. Not every case involved intentional misconduct. Not every employee had acted with prejudice. But the company acknowledged that inconsistent standards created situations where some passengers were asked to prove they belonged before others were. That was the sentence Marcus cared about. Not because it described him, because it described the system. The airline implemented permanent changes. Premium cabin verification requests would now require documented reasons connected to policy or safety requirements. Supervisors would be required to review decisions before escalating passenger concerns. Independent audits would continue quarterly. Employee training would focus not only on customer service but on recognizing how assumptions influence decisions. The changes were not perfect. Marcus knew no policy could guarantee that every person would always make the right choice. People were involved. People made mistakes. But a strong system did something important. It made mistakes easier to identify and harder to repeat. 3 months later, Marcus received an invitation from North Star Meridian Airlines, not for a ceremony, for a training session. He almost declined. He had already spent enough time discussing the incident, but Lena convinced him to attend. You keep saying the point is the next person, she told him. Go meet the people responsible for the next person. So he went. The training center was different from the first time. Less corporate, more practical. The employees worked through real scenarios. They discussed uncomfortable situations. They practiced asking questions without assuming answers. At the end of the session, a new employee approached Marcus. She looked nervous. I wanted to thank you, Marcus smiled. You don't have to thank me. I do. Why? She thought for a moment. Because before this training, I thought being professional meant avoiding conflict. Marcus listened. Now I think it means making sure the conflict is handled fairly. That answer stayed with him. Because fairness was not always comfortable. Sometimes fairness required someone to slow down, to ask another question, to admit the first conclusion might have been wrong. That evening, Marcus returned home. The house was quiet. For months, his life had been filled with meetings, reviews, and conversations about what happened on that flight. Now there was space again. Natalie found him sitting at the kitchen table. You finally stopped working. Marcus looked at the empty notebook in front of him. I think I did, she smiled. Feels strange. A little. He looked at the notebook. On the first day after the incident, he had written, "Sequence matters." Now, underneath it, he added another sentence, "So does what happens after," because the flight had not changed because a CEO was embarrassed. It had changed because people preserved the details, because a witness decided the moment mattered, because employees admitted uncomfortable truths, because a company chose to examine itself instead of only protecting its image. The seat in first class had been the beginning, but it was never the entire story. The real question had always been whether a person needed power before receiving basic respect. Marcus already knew the answer, no, and that was why, months later, when another passenger submitted a complaint through the airline's new reporting system, nobody dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Labeled it an inconvenience. Someone reviewed it. Someone documented it. Someone asked the right question first. Was there evidence? Who is this person? Not do they seem like they belong? Just what actually happened? That was the change Marcus had wanted. Not a company afraid of making mistakes. A company willing to find them, and somewhere above the country, hundreds of flights continued moving through the sky. Passengers boarded, employees worked, systems ran. These days, nobody noticed. That was the point. A good system was not something people celebrated every morning. It was something they trusted without needing to think about it. For Marcus Ellison, the incident that began with a seat ended with something much larger. A record had been corrected, a process had been rebuilt, a responsibility had been accepted, and the next time someone walked into a first-class cabin, nobody would need to know their name before they were treated like they belonged.